Hello everyone, I'm Wendell Jones and welcome to this edition of our program, Jones & Company. Today we look at the national issues of the Bahamas and we look particularly at the public service in our country. Over the last several days, we had quite a discussion on radio concerning a report by the Inter-American Development Bank on the state of the public service here in the Bahamas. And so we invited a veteran public servant on our program today, Mr. LutherSmith, who is a former permanent secretary in several ministries in our country. He also served outside the Bahamas as a high commissioner, and he served in one of the countries in the Pacific, advising a government there. Most recently, he served in our country as the Director General of Bahamas Information Services. And it's our pleasure to have LutherSmith on our program today. Mr. Smith, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good. Godfrey, good to see you.
Thank you.
And you served in the Seychelles, was it?
No, it was in Papua New Guinea.
Papua New Guinea.
Where they
I know
just
it
had
was in the area.
the APEC conference, which ended 2 weekends ago.
Okay.
Yeah, yes, but I was not in the capital itself. I was in one of the provinces, one of the more contentious provinces called Bougainville, or formerly known as the North Solomon province. Yeah.
And you were there to advise the government?
Yes, yes. I was there to advise both governments, the government of Bougainville, which was an autonomous government, and of course the government of Papua New Guinea on the relationship. And I also, because I was an Australian advisor, believe it or not, an advisor hired by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, I also had to send in regular reports to the government of Australia through the mechanism that was provided in Port Moresby.
Yes. In terms of your work in public service, you did some postgraduate work?
Yes, in terms of academic studies, yes, I did some postgraduate work at the University of Manchester, or Manchester University in the United Kingdom, very early in my career. I remember you were a young reporter at the Broadcasting Corporation when I returned, and I went to Manchester in 1976 and completed the postgraduate program in 1977. And that was in itself an experience. There were other Bahamians who had gone through Manchester, but they did the certificate program. I was doing an academic program, the postgraduate in development administration, as it was then called.
Mr. Smith, there's a view that the public service is weakening. That is the opinion of a public servant today, a highly placed public servant today. And I'm sure you might have read aspects of the IDB report on the public service in the Bahamas. There is a need for public service reform, isn't that right?
Yes, it's inevitable, and there has been a lot of talk about it over the years, including the most immediate government, the government of Prime Minister Christie, and I believe even before that there has been talk of reform. And I'm sure the present government must be thinking along those lines, certainly based on the IDB report. But the process of reform is one which must be taken gradually, incrementally, and also in different compartments. The reform has to take on a number of features. And to say reform does not mean changing, for example, the Financial Administration and Audit Act, which is now a very topical thing, fiscal responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. That is necessary reform for the fiscal sector, but that does not in itself represent reform. The reform that is needed is to take account of the fact as to where we are post-independence, 1973. That is a total of 44, 45 years. And we must look at the modalities and those mechanisms that we are now using, that we have employed since 1973 to govern the country and ask ourselves the very real question: are these modalities and mechanisms the right ones for governing a country in the year 2018 and going forward for the next 20 years? And that is the real question. And I think a lot of all of the previous governments, in fact, have skirted around this issue as being too delicate. I must say also that the model of the public service that we have inherited is a model that came to us from the British, and we did not really work with it for long. You must recall that the Bahamas only became an internal self-governing country in 1964, and it was 6 years later, in 1970, that we were granted full internal government with responsibility for the police and a limited amount of relations in terms of foreign affairs. But we were really dealing with a very archaic model, which even the British themselves, who invented it, have largely moved away from. And they have moved away from it in some very imaginative way. And I'm glad you mentioned Papua New Guinea, because their model of public administration is based largely on the Australian model. And that in itself is constantly being reviewed, constantly being revised, constantly being updated to take account of the changing political landscape and the policy landscapes that come with an advancing technological society. Yeah.
Mr. Smith.
Yes.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because we still have a backward system. Backward. Even in CARICOM, many CARICOM countries are administratively modernized better than we are. To give you an example, why should a permanent secretary be head of a technical ministry? In many CARICOM countries, you have the permanent secretary head of administration and the chief technical officer in charge of the technical arm, and they're equals.
Yes, yes, yes.
You see?
Yes.
I resented that when I was a
The director of agriculture.
Yeah, I
Yes,
resented
yes,
that,
yes,
right?
yes.
You bring somebody, don't know nothing about the sector, all right? And I am supposed to report to them, but when it's time to go to cabinet, when it's time to go to explain the cabinet paper to the government, I got to go.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes.
Another thing, you take, for example, in Belize. Belize don't have permanent secretaries.
No.
Belize has CEOs. All right, and they incentivize. And if the ministry doesn't produce, you get fired.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, that's the kind of reform we're talking about. You know what I mean? Because we have these paper permanent secretaries who go from ministry to ministry, and many times they frustrate things. They retard progress.
Well, I think that's exactly the point we were making, in that we are not being cognizant of the current trends. Most ministries have a very strong technical arm. I think of the Ministry of Agriculture, which you've just mentioned, the Ministry of Education, which has an extremely strong professional technical arm, which is the Department of Education. Ministry of Works, of course, I was going to mention that. Sure. And to a limited extent, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which in its entirety deals with foreign affairs, but the real diplomatic and technical work is run through the Director General of that department. The point here is that, as I said, we have been afraid to tinkle with the system because we do not know what we will want to replace it with. But the point where a department stands on its own, for example, the Department of Environmental Health, that is a huge department with a whole lot of legislation that falls within the remit of that department. The director of that department, currently I don't know whether it's reporting to the Ministry of Health or whether it's reporting to the Ministry of Environmental Affairs, because that has been a little murky in the last year in some responsibilities being shifted from one minister, from one portfolio to another portfolio. But the point I'm making, that director or the director of education ought to be able to have complete management control within the context of the law, the policy, and the financial resources.
Yes.
And of course, the minister is the person who has the direction and control of the ministry and the department. That's critical. It doesn't mean, for example, that the technical person runs amok, but the minister is eventually the stopgap.
Yeah, but Mr. Smith, you know, over the years, it seems as though successive governments have done a job on the public service by getting rid of some of the professionals in the public service very early. And there is a middle section there. I think they call it the middle core, or the hollow core of the middle, that has been...
Those were the remarks that I read in the press,
yes,
a hollow core.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mid-management in the public service is really deficient, isn't it?
Yes, it's very deficient, and that is in many areas, that is the real infantry of the public service, the middle management.
Yes.
These are the people who march on the ground and eventually take over the service in years to come. Yes, that is true, and there are a number of reasons for that, which I think we could talk about. But the middle ground is very, very weak, very trained, and also very underexposed. And here's the issue. In that middle level, many of them have never had what I call this cross-fertilization. So there are, for example, scores and scores of people in the Ministry of Education, both in the departmental level and at the technical level, and at the ministry level, who have never served in any area outside of the Ministry of Education. So they know that on a Monday, this file comes to them, and this is the action that must be pursued. On a Tuesday, that must be pursued. On a Wednesday, that must be pursued. On a Thursday, and there's really very little innovation in what they have to do and how they have to do it.
But it's worse than that. This report said that teachers have been moved from the teaching profession into administration, with really little training, no preparation, and in many cases, the ministry that they were sent to, really, they were not even properly transferred.
That is correct. That is correct. There is a whole lot of mopping up that has to be done in the public service. It started some time ago where a teacher would say, or the government of the day would say, so-and-so is a very bright person. They're at S.C. McPherson, or they're at R.M. Bailey School, or they're a senior mistress or head of a department. I think that person will fit in well in the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, for example.
But how can that teacher become a deputy permanent secretary?
Well, that has been the problem. In other words, we have thrown the structure overboard. And when you throw the structure overboard, what you get eventually is chaos. And I think this is the hollow middle that you are referring to.
Yes.
The structure has been thrown overboard. I hate to reminisce on this, but when I entered the public service, I hadn't served anywhere else in the government. I joined the public service basically to be an administrator and an administrative cadet. That's how I came in. And in fairness to the government of the day, and I joined the public service in 1972, in fairness to the government of the day, they had a structure and a plan in place for people such as myself. And if Mr. Godfrey Enos here had decided that he wanted to move away from the technical to the administrative, he would have fitted into that structure as well. And the structure was very, very carefully monitored, carefully evaluated, and so at a particular point in time, you emerge from that structure. Now, part of the issue why there is this chaos is because a lot of people saw people like myself and many others moving up and moving around, And they're saying, well, I got left behind. Well, your job as a teacher was to teach. Your job as a nurse was to do nursing. And your career structure and your career path was different from my structure and my career path. Okay, but be that as it may, if you moved a person from being a teacher, that person needed at least a year or more of retraining, rebranding, retooling to be able to adapt to general and broad administration.
Yeah, because a teacher is not necessarily an administrator.
Precisely.
Let me give you an example in support of what he's saying, right? You could not be a permanent secretary, Mr. Jones, if you didn't go through the cabinet office.
That's right. Most of us did.
After you served the time in the cabinet office, then you would be appointed an acting permanent secretary. You couldn't be, because in the cabinet office, that's the focus of the government. That's the central operational arm of the government.
It was so, and more than that, the exposure was very, very specific and generalized as well, but it was very specific. When I went into the cabinet office, but before you get to that point, after a year at the Ministry of Labor, I never saw myself when I came out of university as going to work at the Ministry of Labor, but that's fine, because what that taught me was how to do some very rudimentary things, how to attend meetings and write minutes, how to précis those minutes, how to get those minutes back up to the permanent secretary, how the permanent secretary would get those minutes over to the minister, and if necessary, the minutes to cabinet, et cetera, okay? So I learned something in that 15, 16 months. After that, we all, the whole group of us, I think over 40, went into what was then called an administrative competition. And it was no window dressing. We were asked to firstly take a pre-qualifying exam administered by some people out of the UK. Then we did the 6 weeks assessment, which was both academic in content, practical in content, but also very focused on how you become an administrator. And it was during that time that they began to evaluate and look and see who had the right temperament for moving ahead. Because a person could have been very bright, but not have the temperament to be a team player. And that model continued on until at least 1992. And then training was de-emphasized. And the training that I referred to is not necessarily only training at that level of assistant secretaries and FASs, but I'm talking about training above that, so that persons who did other courses or who wanted to could do other courses to prepare themselves for eventual promotion. One of the issues that all governments in the Bahamas have had is that we look at training as being a luxury. It's a luxury. Why does he or she want to go to the John F. Kennedy School? Why does he or she want to go to the London School of Economics? Why does he or she want to go to the University of Manchester? Why does he or she want to go to UWI? Why does he or she want to go to the University of Pittsburgh, et cetera, et cetera? And it's because this began to be viewed as a luxury or as an unnecessary need to assist an officer. All of that just gradually fell away. So the result is that the same teachers that you referred to came in en masse. They came in en masse from the classrooms or from being vice principals or from one or two instances being principals, and they went into ministries where they did not have the necessary background. It's a profession. Being a permanent secretary or being a public officer is a profession like any other profession.
We want to take a break here and pick up on some of the things that Mr. LutherSmith just said. We're talking about the public service, the state of the public service in our country. We'll come right back.